study asks an interesting question, which is what happens when AI helps us see something that we didn't even know was there?
People like us going to oncology, not cardiology, to read EKGs, and they would indulge us at P and QRS and T, and then pointing out the subtleties. I thought it was like a really great art. So for AI to pick up something that all these masters of cardiology of eons past had not picked up, and they could do 100,000. But is this remarkable? In 2026, we're talking about a new signal for sudden cardiac death that only has been picked up by AI.
But I can imagine there are going to be many electrophysiologists, cardiologists who are licking their chops, waiting for an onslaught of patients being referred to them because they have a slurred AVL waveform on a routinely done EKG. This finding could be present in up to 2% of the general population. And if that's associated or it reflects what Shruti is describing, some fibrosis, some within the heart, which is predicting conduction abnormalities, a lot of those patients, a lot of those people could be referred for defibrillator placement.
Is AI about to change the way we detect disease before even humans can see it? Welcome back to Only Oncologists in the Building. Today, I want to talk about a version of AI in medicine that feels a little different than the usual conversation. A lot of the times we're trying to think about how AI can help us write our notes, summarize our charts, help radiologists read scans faster. But this study asks an interesting question, which is what happens when AI helps us see something that we didn't even know was there? There was a recent UC Berkeley study that used AI to analyze hundreds of thousands of EKGs and identified a signal associated with sudden cardiac death risk. Now, what caught my attention was not that the model performed better than some of our current tools. It was that the AI may have found a signal in routine tests that humans were not even trained to recognize. And I will admit, because I'm an oncologist at heart, it made me think about how recently we found out that in pancreatic cancer, and we just talked about this, guys, on a recent episode, that we're starting to see that similar idea, right? Mayo Clinic developed that AI model. Again, we talked about it in a previous episode that looked at routine CT scans that had been read as normal, and they found subtle texture-based radiomic changes before cancer was even detected. And so today we're going to talk about the study and how do we make sure AI becomes a tool that improves care instead of that shiny new thing that creates more anxiety, more false positives, and then possibly even more inequity.
One of my most dreaded sessions during residency used to be our EKG rounds, and we had an attending who had a whole stack of EKGs. He'd made them into transparencies, and he'd put them on the projector, and he would call you out, and you had to read the EKGs. And I survived EKG rounds, and I've been very proud of my ability to interpret EKGs. And now to hear that there could be new information that's visible to the eye, that's been right in front of us for so long, that hasn't really been used to risk stratify individuals, is extremely exciting. Because I thought there was nothing. I thought there was nothing new.
You said the magical word transparencies from the late 20th century.
I was going to be like, oh my God.
Shruti knows what a transparency overhead projector is.
I do because I was used in elementary school.
She's nodding her head like, transparencies, overhead projector. Okay. I see this as a proud caliper carrying oncologist as well, but I'm with you because as Shruti was saying this, I'm like, wow, AI, 100,000 EKGs at every institution. Okay, everybody, so let you know, at every medical school, at every residency, there was always an old senior, let's be honest, usually an older white male cardiologist who was retired, but still liked to hang around and go up to grand rounds for like the breakfast donuts or the coffee, but would be very kind and genteel, but it would be a master of cardiologists who would help people like us going to oncology, not cardiology, to read EKGs, and they would indulge us at P and QRS and T, and then pointing out the subtleties. I thought it was like a really great art. So for AI to pick up something that all these masters of cardiology of eons past had not picked up, and they could do 100,000. But is this remarkable? In 2026, we're talking about a new signal for sudden cardiac death that only has been picked up by AI.
I mean, I think it's remarkable. I got to admit, I will tell you, anything that AI can do to help me read EKGs is
Yeah.
incredible because I cannot stand an
Yes.
EKG. I hate EKGs. I'm sorry,
Because
cardiologists,
you were
but
not
like
trained
Yeah.
on transparencies.
on that's why. That's why.
That transparency.
Exactly.
But let me ask you,
But
every EKG machine, right, in the modern era comes out and it tells you, so not human reviewed, it says sinus tachycardia, normal. But here's a question. Do you guys forget about as one step towards AI, and then we'll talk about the AI part. Do you guys believe what comes out of the machine when it comes as a read?
no, I don't. In
Right.
that I can I'm happy that it could be used to guide it, but the reality
Hmm.
is that reading EKGs is so much more nuanced. Like obviously, I think it can pick up like the big findings, like huge ST segment elevations and things like that. I think it can pick up, but I think the smaller ones it doesn't pick up as well. And so I'm still like hunting down a cardiologist or
Oh, always, yeah.
constantly. And so anyways, an AI tool for anything EKG related, I'm all in. But in this study, the AI model identified this high risk group, which was about a little more than 2% of their entire hundreds of thousands of patients. And those patients had a 7% annual sudden cardiac death rate. And that's compared to 4.6 annual risk in patients that are flagged as at risk for sudden cardiac death. And I think even more importantly, 86% of those people that were identified in that high risk patient group were not flagged by ejection fraction, which is how we normally kind of risk
Mm.
stratify these patients. So what that means is that it's not just, oh, this tool is rediscovering the same patients that we already identify. It's no, where 86% of these people would have not been identified by kind of classical tools that we use. And then the part that I think is again the most interesting is there are multiple leads as we know, and they found a signal in AVL. Now I'm going to be honest, I don't remember where in the thing that is, but and basically how they described it is a slurred terminal portion of the R wave slash QRS complex. And so again, I just think it's like crazy that we're discovering like a new way to risk stratify
Mm.
patients. And EKG is common. It's cheap. It's
Mhm.
done everywhere in all of our cancer patients, in all of our, it's done everywhere. And so it makes this feel very scalable on kind of a even a global context.
So this is 100,000 EKGs, and I guess what do the investigators say the next steps are from here? Do they need to confirm and validate this and 100,000 more EKGs, separate and more diverse population, or a population that has never had any cardiovascular compromise, not at risk because of the cholesterol level or anything else that's already known?
Yeah, so they looked at basically they developed the model in like a Swedish cohort, and then
Mm.
they used a kind of a discovery cohort in the United States and in Taiwan, right? So they're looking pretty much
Okay.
everywhere. I do
Yeah.
think that the authors suggest that this EKG signal could reflect myocardial conduction abnormalities, maybe subtle fibrosis, and then they did a small cardiac MRI review of some of those patients who ended up having cardiac MRI, and it actually showed more late gadolinium enhancement, which kind of supports this fibrosis theory. I think how they're good. I think obviously they have studies that are emerging, kind of looking at this prospectively. But I think something that I've been thinking about, and I imagine the authors are thinking about, is how does this identifying risk is just like one step of this entire puzzle. The next question is, what do you do with that risk?
Yeah.
I can imagine there are going to be many electrophysiologists, cardiologists who are licking their chops, waiting for an onslaught of patients being referred to them because they have a slurred AVL waveform on a routinely done
Mm.
EKG. This finding could be present in up to 2% of the general population. And if that's
Okay.
associated or it reflects what Shruti is describing, some fibrosis, some within the heart, which is predicting conduction abnormalities, a lot of those patients, a lot of those people could be referred for defibrillator placements. you can now imagine the burden that that can place on the individuals who may or may not need it for their risk factor profile, what burden it can put on the health system, how it can gum up the system. There are states in the United States that have like one EP cardiologist. Like these folks are very it's a very nuanced skill set, and there are a lot of people who require their expertise. And are we going to flood that referral pattern with otherwise healthy people who've had an incidental finding? Very similar to the discussions that we've had with other findings, even on the point that Shruti was making about the non-contrast CT that appears visible, but the AI is saying there could be pancreatic cancer hidden in
Right.
there. So I think there are a lot of workflow issues that we have to come up with. And what two things that I'm thinking about when it comes to this is similar to how we've dissected other challenges on this podcast before. Number one, this is correlation, not causation. What makes this a
Mhm.
little better than just a mere correlation is that with the MRI data, there is a proposed hypothesized mechanism with the fibrosis. So it kind of goes a bit higher level than just being a correlation. But the thing that I'm concerned about is how this correlation came about with a correlation with very homogeneous populations. We don't really know whether that association is going to exist as we move into other population types in the United States, for example, where 20% are African American, 10% could be Hispanic, East Asian individuals, on how exactly that one waveform is going to translate into into other populations, and what their risk profile is going to look like, and whether they're a candidate for intervention or not. Or again, have we just labeled them as having high risk for cardiac death, which is going to lead to unintended consequences on how they lead their lives, on how they interact with the world, and sort of their activities of daily living.
If there's something I learned during my very cardiology intensive residency, because Duke was built on the foundation of cardiology, apparently. They have a lot of algorithms and nomograms and scores and acronyms and all their, on their trials. And so, a lot of it has to do with the cholesterol, and then you combine that with the cardiac history and the family history. But if this is linked to sudden cardiac death, there's no way that this isn't going to, like, a busy family medicine physician or internal medicine physician is not going to perseverate on the slur that a computer AI will print out and not make that instant referral, right? So whether it's a
Yeah.
general cardiologist, go right to EP. As you said, I mean, that could flood the system. Knowledge is power to an extent until you get a diminishing returns and just uses up resources, creates the anxiety all around, and it may not lead to anything. But I do wonder if this is truly, if the association here is not just like a 10-year, 5% increase in mortality. It's if you're saying sudden cardiac death, that that heightens goes up the ladder in terms of urgency, and how urgently someone will be referred to the system, and how many of those people, like how many people do you need to evaluate and have intervention, like a defibrillator, as you mentioned, to actually save one life? Number
Number
needed
needed
to
to treat.
evaluate. Yeah, exactly.
Right. I think one of the biggest risks in AI early detection is that everybody hears earlier and assumes better, which a lot of times it is, right? I'm not saying it's not, but we actually, as oncologists, come across the same issue with ctDNA, right? We have a positive
Mm.
ctDNA and a negative scan. What do? Right? Like it's a tale as old as time. I feel not really, because all these technologies are new. But the point is that it's applicable to all these different specialties, right? It's you have a positive result, you don't have the intervention, right? Or you don't have access to the intervention, or we don't have enough, or defibrillator is not a trivial intervention as well, right? Like that is, you are putting a device, you're putting it right there, in the heart, touching the heart. And so I just think that we really need to be thoughtful. It's super exciting. And right, I saw this and I was like, I will say South Asians have a high risk of cardiac disease. And I personally know people that have died from sudden cardiac death. And it's one of the most traumatic, horrible things ever. And so I saw this, and I will tell you, my dad texted me this link like a few days ago, and it's really exciting when you see those headlines. But the more and more I was like reading through it and digging, even though I still like hold a lot of that excitement, I don't know how we're going to operationalize it. And really, the hope is that we minimize risk and intervention, but we also maximize, how do we save people from a fate like this?
And every time we review EKGs, like we know that the EKG itself is not a diagnostic tool. It's just it provides one variable, one clinical variable that the clinician needs to add in along with the person's history, their other medical problems, what medications they're on, their family history, their exposure history, and come up with what the risk should be. So I think there is a word of caution that we're not saying that you just can make a determination or a diagnosis based on a specific waveform on one lead of a 12 lead EKG. This is ripe for having issues related to overdiagnosis, which can, I've made this point before, have impacts on whether someone can get life insurance or health insurance or family history of conditions. And we always shy away from making a diagnosis with this just one clinical variable. We do need to put that together. And I think this team or the teams that are working in this space have started to put this together with some associations with ejection fraction, but also other aspects. But what we're used to seeing in the cardiology space, to the point that Shruti you were making, is an association with clinical history, family history, ethnic history, biomarker status, and I think we're just in the beginning of this phase with what we're learning about the slurred AVL waveform. And there's a lot more that's going to come in that can hopefully stratify what could be a very large proportion of the population that's impacted by this variant.
Absolutely. So my takeaway is this. The most exciting AI in medicine may not be the AI that replaces what doctors do, but it may be the AI that shows us patterns that we never knew to look for. But we have to be very cautious in our kind of in rolling this out, because overdiagnosis and just putting defibrillators or putting doing procedures on people is also not the solution. And so I think really interesting paper, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that lab next.